It was October 19th, just past midnight, when I got the call from Ella Thompson. Miller's Glen was quiet, almost too quiet. A town with just under 2,000 residents where everyone knew each other's names. And yet, children were disappearing. It had started again, the same way it did 30 years ago. No traces, no noise, just gone. Ella's voice came through my phone, shaky and determined. She said she had a lead, something about a legend and a society, and she needed help. I grabbed my old jacket, the one I hadn't worn since I left the force 8 years ago. The house was empty, save for the hum of the fridge and the creak of the wooden floors as I made my way to the door. I knew there was no going back. I hadn't planned on facing my past tonight, but Ella always had a way of dragging you into things. By 12:45, I was driving down Miller's Lane, a narrow road lined with thick trees, the headlights illuminating patches of fog that seemed almost alive. We met at the old diner, the one that was still clinging to the past with its red leather booths and broken jukebox. Ella sat in the corner, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of her, her eyes darting nervously to the door every time it swung open. She wasn't alone. Sam Whitaker was with her. He looked older, more worn down, his eyes tired, but still sharp. He nodded as I approached. I hadn't seen him since his partner disappeared, the same night he quit the force. A shadow passed over his expression, but he shook it off. "We have to go see Liam," Ella said, getting straight to business. "He's been keeping records, journals, everything about Miller's Glen's history. He thinks he knows what's happening." Liam Turner lived in a cluttered house near the edge of town, surrounded by books and piles of old newspapers. The kind of place that seemed like it had never seen a vacuum cleaner. We got there by 1:20 a.m. Liam was waiting for us, his eyes bright despite the late hour, his face lighting up when he saw Ella. He ushered us inside, excited, like he had been waiting for this moment for years. "The Miller's wife," he began, flipping open an ancient, dusty book. "She's the one they say is taking the children. A woman who lost her own child centuries ago. Her grief keeps her here, and she takes others to fill that void. But there's more." He paused, pulling out a map of the town marked with symbols. "The artifact, it's connected to her. It was broken, but not completely destroyed." By 2:00 a.m., we were back in the truck, heading toward the old church, the artifact's supposed hiding place. The moon was half hidden behind clouds, casting shadows over the road, making everything feel even more ominous. Sam drove, his jaw clenched, his eyes focused straight ahead. He'd been having nightmares for weeks now, dreams of his old partner, standing in the darkness, whispering warnings he couldn't quite make out. The church stood at the center of Miller's Glen, a tall, looming structure from another era. The doors creaked open, and the cold air hit us. Inside, it was pitch dark, our flashlights flickering as if the batteries were failing. We made our way to the altar, where Liam said the artifact should be hidden, underneath the stone tiles. Ella's hands shook as she pried up the tiles, revealing a small metal box. The artifact, or at least what was left of it, glinted in the dim light. But before we could do anything, we heard footsteps. Kayla Ramirez burst through the doors, her face pale, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "He's gone!" she cried. "The boy I was babysitting, he's gone! I turned around for just a second and the lights went out and he was gone!" Ella looked at me, her eyes wide, and I knew what she was thinking. The Miller's wife had taken him. We didn't have much time. Liam was frantically turning the pages of his book, muttering about the artifact, how it needed to be whole to stop her. Sam's face went pale, and he spoke quietly, almost as if to himself. "My partner, he left a note. Said something about the artifact. Said it wasn't completely destroyed." We ended up at an old house on the outskirts of town by 3:30 a.m. The house was falling apart, the windows broken, the door hanging off its hinges. Sam led the way, his flashlight flickering in the dark. In the basement, we found it, a small piece of the artifact, hidden beneath the floorboards. Liam took it, his hands trembling as he fit the pieces together. There was a soft glow, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then the air grew cold, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift. The miller's wife appeared before us, her face twisted in grief, her eyes hollow. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Kayla, who stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear. "You took my child," she whispered, her voice echoing in the darkness. It was then that we realized. She wasn't the enemy. The real enemy was the people who had bound her, who had used her grief and turned it into something monstrous. The secret society, the ones who had kept their power by sacrificing others. Kayla looked at me, tears streaming down her face, and I knew what she was going to do. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "Take me instead," she said. "Let him go." There was a flash of light, blinding and cold, and then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, the miller's wife was gone. The boy lay on the floor, unconscious but unharmed. Kayla was gone too, her sacrifice breaking the cycle, setting the spirit free. By dawn, we were back in town, the sun rising over the trees, casting a golden glow over Miller's Glen. The church bells rang, and for the first time in weeks, the town felt at peace. Ella stood beside me, her eyes red from crying, her hands still trembling. Sam was quiet, staring at the horizon, lost in thought. And Liam, he just looked tired, like a man who had finally put down a burden he had been carrying for far too long. The secret society was still out there, and we knew this wasn't over. But for now, the children were safe, and the miller's wife was at peace. And that was enough. Story 2. It was July 17th. The sun was setting over the Mojave Desert, painting the sky in streaks of burnt orange and red. Jimmy Reynolds had called me late in the afternoon, and I knew better than to ignore it. He had that tone, the kind of voice that meant he was onto something big, something dangerous. By 6:45 p.m., I was in his beat-up Jeep, Olivia in the front seat, her face set in a mixture of exasperation and curiosity. She'd always been skeptical, but there was a part of her that couldn't stay away from the thrill. We drove until the road ended, and then some more. The abandoned military base was about 40 miles deep into the desert, a place locals avoided like the plague. Jimmy had always been chasing the truth, and this time he was convinced it was hidden beneath the sand of the Mojave. He said the government had conducted experiments out here, and Sergeant Marcus Hale, an old army man who seemed broken by the things he'd seen, was finally ready to talk. Hale met us near an old water tower, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. The way his eyes darted around made it clear that he was scared. Really scared. We picked up Nate Johnson around 8 p.m., just as the first stars started peeking out. He had the kind of confidence that made you feel safe, like he'd been surviving out here his whole life. And maybe he had. Jimmy hired him to get us in, and more importantly, get us out. The base was off limits, guarded by half-rusted fences and shadowy patrols. We needed Nate's knowledge of the land to avoid getting caught before we even got close. By 9:45 p.m., we were standing at the edge of the base, the remains of old barbed wire fences twisted and barely visible under the desert moonlight. The temperature had dropped sharply, and we all felt it, the strange chill that had nothing to do with the desert air. Jimmy was whispering into his camera, his flashlight just barely illuminating the cracked pavement as we crept forward. Olivia rolled her eyes at him, but I could see the nervous energy in her movements. She wasn't here just to disprove his theories. She wanted to know, just as much as Jimmy did. The first strange thing happened around 10:15 p.m. We were walking past a crumbling watchtower when we heard it. Voices carried by the wind. It was soft, almost like a child's laughter, and it made my skin crawl. Marcus stiffened, his hand going to the gun at his belt. He'd been quiet since we picked him up, but now he turned to Jimmy, his face pale. "They're still here," he muttered. Jimmy, of course, just got more excited. We found the entrance to the underground tunnels shortly after midnight, a rusted metal hatch half buried in the sand. Nate pried it open, the hinges groaning in protest. A blast of cold air rushed out, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the darkness below. Jimmy was the first to go down, his flashlight flickering as he descended. Olivia followed, her jaw set. Marcus hesitated, then nodded at me. "You stay close," he said. "Don't touch anything." The tunnels were worse than I had imagined. Dark, damp, and filled with the stench of decay. The walls were lined with old pipes, some of them still dripping with something that looked far too thick to be water. We found rooms, dozens of them, filled with rusted medical equipment, strange diagrams pinned to the walls, and photographs. The people in the photos looked wrong. Their limbs too long, their faces twisted, their eyes hollow. Olivia was filming everything, her hands shaking as she moved from room to room. Jimmy was practically buzzing with excitement. Marcus stopped us in front of a metal door, his eyes distant. "This is where it happened," he whispered. He pushed the door open, revealing a large, empty room. The floor was stained, and there were chains bolted to the walls. "They wanted to make super soldiers," he said, his voice hollow. "But it went wrong. One of them, he survived. He's still here. They left him here." It was just past 2 a.m. when things went really wrong. Nate, who had been quiet for most of the time, his eyes darting around like he was listening for something, suddenly turned on us. He pulled a gun, pointing it at Jimmy. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice almost breaking. "I didn't want to do this, but they're watching. They said I'd be safe if I made sure none of you left." Before I could even react, Marcus lunged at Nate, knocking the gun from his hand. The two of them struggled, the sounds echoing through the tunnel. Jimmy grabbed Olivia, pulling her away as I scrambled to help Marcus. Nate was strong, stronger than he looked, and it took both of us to pin him down. He was screaming now, shouting about them and how they were going to come for us. We ran. I don't remember much about those next few minutes, just the adrenaline, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the metal walls, and the feeling of something, someone, chasing us. We burst out of the hatch, the cold desert air hitting us like a slap. And then we saw him. He stood at the edge of the base, half in shadow. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his eyes sunken, his limbs too long. He didn't move, just watched us, his head tilted slightly, like he was curious. Marcus stepped forward, his hands raised. "It's okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We're not here to hurt you." The figure moved then, stepping out of the shadows. He looked at us, his eyes locking on mine, and for a moment, I felt it. His fear, his confusion. He wasn't a monster. He was trapped, left behind, just like Marcus had said. Then Nate screamed. He had managed to get free, his eyes wild, and he lunged at the figure, a knife in his hand. Marcus moved to intercept, and everything happened too fast. There was a flash of metal, a shout, and then Marcus was on the ground, blood staining the sand beneath him. "Run!" he shouted, his voice raw. Jimmy grabbed my arm, pulling me away. Olivia was crying, her camera still clutched in her hand. We ran, the figure watching us as we disappeared into the desert. By dawn, we had made it back to the road, Nate nowhere in sight. Olivia was hurt, a deep gash on her arm, but she was alive. We flagged down a truck, the driver giving us strange looks as we climbed in, covered in dirt and blood. Jimmy didn't say a word, his eyes distant, his camera gone. We made it back to town by 8:30 a.m. Jimmy uploaded the footage that afternoon, every shaky frame of it. But by midnight, it was gone, deleted, his account locked. And then, the next morning, we heard about Nate. Found dead in his trailer, no signs of struggle. Olivia got a message that night, a simple text from an unknown number. Some truths are better left buried. She showed it to me, her hands trembling. We both knew what it meant. Jimmy still talks about going back, about finding more evidence, but I'm done. Some things are better left alone. Story 3. It was June 3rd, around 6:30 in the morning when Tommy Hayes, me and Nguyen, Ethan Patel and I packed up the Jeep for our weekend trip to Black Hollow Canyon. Tommy was buzzing with excitement, his gear clattering as he loaded it in the back. The canyon had this dark reputation. Disappearances, weird cult stories, you name it. But that only seemed to add to his enthusiasm. Mia, on the other hand, was quieter, adjusting her hat as she slid into the passenger seat. She was here for the plants, the rare ones that apparently thrived only within the depths of the canyon. Ethan sat next to me in the back, his eyes already glued to his drone controller. He was live streaming everything, mumbling a running commentary to his small Twitch audience. By 9 a.m., we reached the edge of the canyon, the sky a bright, cloudless blue. Black Hollow stretched out before us, jagged rock walls rising sharply on either side, casting dark, ominous shadows across the dirt path. It was a place that seemed to swallow sound. Even the wind died down as we got closer, the only noise the crunch of gravel beneath our boots. That's when we met Rose. She stood near an old, rusted sign that warned hikers to keep out, her long, dark coat catching the breeze. Her eyes locked on Tommy first, a look of knowing concern on her face. "You kids need to turn around," she said, her voice carrying an edge of desperation. The canyon isn't just dangerous because of cliffs or wild animals. There are echoes, voices that will lure you in, make you lost. Tommy, being Tommy, just grinned, thanking her for the heads up, before motioning for us to follow him down the path. I caught the way Mia hesitated, her eyes lingering on Rose for a second longer before she sighed and trudged on. Rose's warning was chilling, but Tommy's confidence had a way of making you think you'd be okay. We hiked through the canyon for hours. By 3:30 p.m., we were deep inside, surrounded by towering red rock, the narrow path twisting and turning until I felt completely disoriented. Mia had already found several samples of strange, waxy leaves that she said she'd never seen before. Tommy kept daring Ethan to fly his drone higher, which resulted in a few close calls with rock overhangs, much to Ethan's annoyance. Then, around dusk, just before 8 p.m., we found the clearing. The light was fading and shadows stretched long across the stone floor, highlighting strange symbols carved into the rock face. Mia's eyes lit up, and she immediately knelt to take rubbings, her fingers tracing the lines with curiosity. "These symbols, they look ancient," she whispered, and Ethan leaned in closer, the drone hovering silently above, capturing everything. Tommy shrugged. "Probably just some bored kids playing cult." He kicked a small rock towards the symbols, smirking. But there was something about the carvings that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, like they were alive, like they were watching. By 11 p.m., we'd set up camp. Ethan was in the middle of a live stream, showing his viewers the symbols Mia had found, while Tommy poked at the fire, a mischievous smile on his face. That's when we heard it. A voice, distant, echoing through the canyon. "Help!" It was faint, but unmistakable. We all looked up, the firelight flickering against our faces. Ethan scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Probably just the wind," he said, though his eyes were wide. Tommy, of course, was already on his feet, grabbing a flashlight. "Let's check it out," he said, his grin widening. Mia hesitated, glancing between Tommy and Ethan. "Tommy, what if it's what Rose said?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But Tommy just shook his head. "Come on, Mia. You don't really believe that, do you?" And before we could argue, he was heading toward the dark, his flashlight bobbing with every step. Ethan sighed, muttering something about content before he followed, his drone buzzing above. We followed the voice deeper into the canyon. It was strange. It sounded like it was all around us, shifting with the wind, changing direction. By 1 a.m., we found ourselves in another clearing. This one filled with stacked stones, arranged in patterns that didn't make any sense. And that's when we heard it again. Only this time, it was our voices. Ethan, Mia, Tommy. The words echoed through the dark, bouncing off the canyon walls. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and Mia grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. "It's us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan's face had gone pale, his eyes glued to his screen as the drone's feed showed movement in the distance. Hooded figures, watching us from the shadows. That's when Rose reappeared, stepping out from the darkness, her face illuminated by the moonlight. "You need to leave," she said, her voice urgent. "You've activated them. The echoes. They're awake now." Tommy shook his head, stepping forward. "What are you talking about? We haven't done anything." But Rose ignored him, her eyes locked on Mia. "The rubbings. You took something from them. You have to put it back, destroy it, before it's too late." It was too late. Before we could react, the echoes began to change, to shift. The voices turned angry, distorted. Tommy's grin faded, replaced by confusion and fear. He turned, his flashlight swinging wildly, but there was nothing there. And then, just like that, he was gone, pulled into the darkness, his scream echoing around us. We searched for him, called his name, but all we got in return were echoes, twisted versions of Tommy's voice, mocking us, leading us in circles. By 3:45 a.m., Rose led us to a hidden altar, her movements hurried, her eyes darting around as if she expected something to leap out at us. Mia was shaking, her hands clutching the rubbings she'd taken. "We have to burn them," Rose said, her voice steady. "It's the only way to break the connection." Mia hesitated, her eyes welling with tears. "But Tommy," she started, but Rose cut her off. "Tommy's gone. What's left isn't him. It's an echo, and it will use his voice to trap you here." With shaking hands, Mia set the rubbings on the altar, striking a match and letting the flames consume them. The air around us seemed to shudder, the temperature dropping even further. That's when we heard it. Tommy's voice screaming, pleading, "Mia, don't!" It was coming closer, the sound of footsteps echoing against the canyon walls. Mia closed her eyes, her tears falling as she dropped the last of the rubbings into the fire. The flames roared, and then silence. The echoes stopped, the air grew still, and the canyon fell into a heavy, eerie quiet. By dawn, the sun was rising over Black Hollow, the first rays of light painting the canyon in soft, golden hues. Rose stood by the altar, her eyes tired, her shoulders sagging. "The echoes will never be truly gone," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "They rest now, but they'll always be here, waiting." Mia and Ethan didn't say a word as we made our way back to the Jeep. Tommy's final scream still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of what we had lost. We left the canyon behind, but I knew. None of us would ever forget what had happened there. The way Tommy's voice had twisted, his laughter turned into something dark and cruel. By the time we reached the edge of town, it was just after 10 a.m. Mia looked back one last time, her eyes filled with grief. We may. Story 4. It was September 14th when Daniel White and his sister-in-law, Elena Garcia, boarded the rickety fishing boat that would take them to Augustine Island, off the coast of Maine. The sea stretched out endlessly, a gray blanket under a leaden sky, and Daniel looked like a ghost of himself, staring silently at the waves. It had been 10 months since he lost his wife, and he'd taken the job as the island's lighthouse keeper as a way to escape, to drown himself in isolation. Elena insisted on coming along. She wasn't about to let Daniel spiral alone, not when he looked so broken. By 4:15 p.m., the boat bumped against the old dock, and Caleb Frost, The fisherman who brought them eyed the lighthouse that rose above the cliffs. It loomed against the stormy sky, its light turning in slow, steady circles, illuminating the sea in flashes. Caleb handed Elena a crate of supplies. "I'll be back next week. You watch yourselves," he said, his voice low, wary. "The lights in the fog. They're not just stories, you know. Seen too many lighthouse keepers go mad out here." Elena gave a polite smile, though the warning sent a chill through her. She glanced at Daniel, who was already trudging up the steep path to the lighthouse. His shoulders slumped under the weight of grief. The island was desolate. Sharp rocks, gnarled trees bending in the wind, and the only sound was the restless crash of waves below. There was no welcome here. By 9 p.m., they'd settled into the lighthouse's cramped living quarters. Daniel was lost in thought, staring at a photograph of his late wife that he'd propped on the windowsill. Elena busied herself unpacking, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. The fog was rolling in thick from the sea, swallowing the island inch by inch. It was around 11:45 p.m. when Daniel first saw the lights. Elena was asleep, and he had been sitting by the window, unable to rest. Out over the water, two glowing orbs moved slowly, weaving through the mist like dancers. They were mesmerizing, moving in a rhythm that seemed almost familiar. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding. He just knew, that it was her, his wife. She was out there, waiting for him. The next morning, Elena found him standing at the edge of the cliffs, staring out to sea, the morning light casting long shadows across his face. She called his name, her voice sharp with worry. He turned, smiling, but there was something off in his eyes, something distant. "The lights," he said softly. "She's out there, Elena. I have to find her." Elena shivered. She knew this wasn't healthy. She knew grief could twist reality, make people see things that weren't there. She tried to reason with him, but Daniel was already lost in the illusion. By September 16th, Caleb returned with supplies. He was uneasy, his eyes scanning the fog-choked landscape. "Seen the lights, haven't you?" he muttered to Daniel, a look of sympathy crossing his face. "Listen to me, lad. There's a shipwreck out there, from 1823. The captain went mad, took his whole crew with him to the depths. The lights, they're not your wife. They're something else. They lure you in, make you see what you want to see." Daniel didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Elena watched the exchange, her worry growing. She tried to keep Daniel close, to distract him with the upkeep of the lighthouse, with fixing the broken shutters and cleaning the lenses. But at night, he'd always find his way to the window, staring out, waiting. It was on September 19th, just past midnight, when the storm hit. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and rain lashed against the lighthouse walls. Elena was jolted awake by a loud banging, the door slamming open and shut. She scrambled out of bed, her heart pounding. Daniel was gone. She rushed outside, the rain stinging her face, her eyes struggling to see through the sheets of water. And then she saw it. Daniel rowing a small boat out to sea, the waves tossing him around like a toy. She screamed his name, her voice lost in the storm, her feet slipping on the wet rocks as she tried to reach the edge of the cliff. A soft voice spoke behind her. Elena spun around, her heart skipping a beat. A girl stood there, her hair dark and wet, her eyes wide with fear. She looked no older than 12, her white dress plastered to her skin by the rain. She didn't say anything, just lifted a small hand, pointing towards the water. "Who are you?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. But the girl only shook her head, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed too old for her young face. And then Elena knew. This was Grace, the girl from Caleb's stories, the captain's daughter. She'd died with the crew, her spirit trapped here, trying to save others from her father's madness. Without another thought, Elena turned, racing towards the cliffs. She had to save Daniel. She couldn't let him be taken by whatever haunted this place. She reached the edge, her eyes straining against the dark, and there she saw him. Daniel standing in the boat, reaching out towards the lights that danced just beyond his grasp. They flickered, bright and alluring, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure in the glow. A woman, her features blurred, her arms open. "Daniel!" Elena screamed, her voice raw. He turned, his face twisted in confusion, as if he was waking from a dream. And then the lights moved, rushing towards him, the water churning violently. Grace appeared at Elena's side, her small hand gripping Elena's arm. "He has to let go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "You have to make him let go." Elena closed her eyes, her tears mixing with the rain. "Daniel, please," she called, her voice breaking. "It's not her. She's gone. Please come back to me." For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The wind died down, the waves stilled, and Daniel lowered his hand, his eyes locking with Elena's. He stepped back, the lights fading as he did, their glow growing dimmer until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the sea. By dawn, the storm had passed. The lighthouse stood silent, its light still turning, casting long shadows over the cliffs. Daniel sat on the rocks, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Elena sat beside him, her arm around his shoulders, her heart aching with relief and sorrow. Caleb arrived later that day, his boat bobbing in the calmer waters. He looked at Daniel, then at Elena, a grim understanding in his eyes. "The lights will always be here," he said quietly, helping them load their bags onto the boat. "But so will she. She'll keep watching, keep protecting those she can." As they left Augustine Island behind, Elena looked back at the lighthouse, its silhouette stark against the morning sky. She saw a figure at the top, a girl in white, her face hidden in shadow, her hand raised in a silent farewell. Elena knew they'd escaped, but the island would always hold a piece of them. Some places, she realized, were never meant to be forgotten.